Discussing Ritchie Robertson, The Enlightenment, a massive tome. It's a very long and very deep and far-reaching book trying to explain the Enlightenment, which is a period of time between sort of 1650 and 1780, 1790 in Europe. I believe in the Enlightenment is the most important development in the universe, actually. And the reason I believe that is because I'm very Deutschian when it comes to that. I believe the human ability to generate knowledge is the most important force of transformation in the universe. I'm going to explain what I mean with that a little bit further down the road. But the Enlightenment is sort of the opening up of this massive potential. I want to talk about three things. First, people are the entity that generates explanations. So people are the entity that generates explanations. People don't have to be humans, by the way. This is just nomenclature, but it's important to understand this. However, the Enlightenment is the beginning of that process where explanations are sought for all kinds of things. For nature, science is born, or the science that we know of today. Explanations for political systems are being sought. Question marks about, absolute power and what kind of government we should have. Revolutions come along, such as the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So people come to their senses. They try to understand what's going on. So again, the first point is people are the entity that generates explanations. The beginning of that process is the Enlightenment. So this is the first thing. So the beginning of the process of looking for explanations. The second thing is this happens through an iterative process, a democracy of ideas. The ability, the democratizing of ideas itself is in line with democratizing almost everything else, including political power. And third, it's not about humans, actually. Knowledge is substrate independent. It can go further. This is not what's been talked about in the Enlightenment. This is a modern view of the Enlightenment, which is the continuation of the Enlightenment. And its knowledge is substrate independent. It doesn't actually even depend on humans. People are the thing that generates explanations. People can be, for example, AI can be people. So this is very important. I want to distinguish that and talk about this in light of Ritchie Robertson's book, which I think is a very important piece of literature, highly recommended for people, because we also live in times that those questions are coming up. This is a Not Even Wrong podcast. It's August 25th, 2023. This is Krim Delco. Since the last update, we're up 6.5%. The market's up 70 basis points. For the year, we are up 106.5%. The market is up 14.75%. We're outperforming by 91.85%. Ritchie Robertson, The Enlightenment, a massive tome about the ideas that characterize this period of time in Europe, incredibly important because it's the beginning of a massive process. Just to give a little bit of historic context, this is beginning to form sort of in the 1650s area. I believe it started out in the Reformation in Europe. So the idea that we give up on the absolute power of the church is preceding this movement where people then stand up and think about, okay, well, if we give up on the church, then we might as well give up on everything and just start re-evaluating what is and what isn't. And this is really what the Enlightenment is all about. It's the development of explanations for all kinds of things. So I would say this is definitely the most important part of the Enlightenment, which is that developing, having a culture of exploration, having a culture of figuring out explanations for things. This is what the Enlightenment did. Now, this hasn't been new in Europe. We've seen that also during the Antiquity. The Renaissance is called the Renaissance. It's the rebirth of the Antiquity because people are coming back to their senses in trying to understand the world. What the Enlightenment did, though, it's starting to form a human-centric, observational, and empirical type of exploration, right? So it's what I see is what I know, and what I know is what I see. Galileo, and then Bacon, and then Descartes, and then there's a big controversy between Descartes and Bacon, for example, where Bacon says it's all empirical, and Descartes said, no, I think about it first, and then I can form my sort of understanding of the world through thinking and then seeing. I think this all culminates in today's thinking, David Deutsch and Popper, at least from my perspective, where we have to admit that observations are theory-laden, that observations themselves actually mean nothing, that we have to have a theory. So it's an interplay of those two things, and the progress that happens through theory, observation, testing, and solving of problems. That's the key, solving of problems. These are new words. This is not what the Enlightenment was about. I think solving a problem, this sentence has not been uttered in the whole book, and it's a very long book, I can tell you that, by Ritchie Robertson. So the Enlighteners haven't thought about solving problems per se. They were more interested in more absolute truth, because they were coming from a religious background where absolute truth, absolute power by monarchs, absolute knowledge by God, all of these things were still deep in the minds of the people. I think 250 years later, 300 years later, we're much more advanced in the sense that we gave up on this idea of having absolute knowledge about things. We only can progress by solving problems and finding explanation for things. But what the Enlightenment did, it set the seeds for that. It gave us this culture of finding explanations for things and questioning things and democratizing the ideas, democratizing the way we do things, democratizing, all kinds of things. Science, of course, a big one, because science is fundamentally driven by the curiosity and the necessity to explain. There's no other way to do science. So the scientific revolution, which is a corollary of the Enlightenment, is rooted in the ability of humans to collaborate together and look for explanations. Now, explanations, these are words that I'm using, these are modern words that I borrow from David Deutsch. Explanations are knowledge that is hard to vary and that keeps proliferating itself through the universe and the multiverse. Again, this is not, of course, Enlightenment talk, but I'm using this modern talk to draw the arch. We are still living in those times. This is not some past time. It's only a few hundred years ago, and we are still living. We have a system in the United States which is rooted in the Enlightenment. Our Constitution, the whole country is built on the Enlightenment. The United States is the manifestation of enlightened ideas. That's why this country has been so successful in many ways. And I want to, if I have some time in this episode, also talk about the dangers of the Enlightenment, which is very important. So this would be the fourth point that I want to mention, which is I want to talk about the fact that people are the thing that create explanations, that explanations are what it's all about, that explanations and people are not necessarily humans. And then fourth, also the dangers of Enlightenment. The dangers of Enlightenment being that we're undermining our own system through central banking and monetary or monetization of government debt, and we have statism, and therefore a big threat to the democracy of ideas, the freedom, the democracy of livelihoods, and all of these things which are key components of the Enlightenment are being undermined actually by central banking, which is a little bit ironic, because today there was the Jackson Hole meeting by the Fed, and it happens to be just today that I'm doing this episode, but I think it's really timely. So now let's talk about all these four things in sequence. Number one, people are the thing that creates explanations. So that's it. That's what David Deutsch says, and it goes back to the Enlightenment, which is a time when people are humans. So in those times, people are humans. So when we talk about Ritchie Robertson's book, it is really just humans. Later on, we'll introduce AI and other type of forms that could be creating knowledge, but for the Enlightenment, it's just people. So humans create knowledge. It's all kinds of humans. It's not just the clergy. It's a democracy of ideas. in a sense also that anybody can do it. Anybody has the ability to create knowledge. It's not just the clergy or whoever. It is anybody can do it, and it is a democracy of ideas. It's a democracy of it's a democracy of knowledge also. It's a democracy of status. It's not just if you're a professor at some sort of university or something like that, that you have the ability to create knowledge. Anybody can do it, and it's substrate independent, not just between humans. It's substrate independent also. It doesn't have to be human, but anyway, I'm going to talk about this. So the capacity to develop explanations is the fundamental driving force of the Enlightenment, and it's carrying on until today. The capacity also to question authority. Now, authorities have been questioned all the time, and this is a criticism also that David Deutsch expresses against the sort of simple explanation of what the Enlightenment is. It's not just questioning authority. It is part of it, and by questioning authority, it means that we're questioning, okay, who decides what is and what isn't? And the person that decides what is and what isn't is the one with the best explanations. This is the ideal form. Now, Kant has his own ideas here. Some of the big proponents of the Enlightenment, Kant, one of them, talk about how this happens. And Kant says there's a sort of natural force. This is a little bit, I would say, Elon Musk is in that field, where Elon Musk says there's a natural force of irony which proliferates throughout the world, and the most ironic and most entertaining solutions end up winning. Kant says more, well, the good solutions end up winning. This is, up for debate. Popper talks about solutions, and we have other proponents of the Enlightenment, such as Voltaire, who is very cynical about it, who questions a lot of things. And we have to question also the risks of the Enlightenment. I'm going to do this towards the end. I think importantly, though, in the book, now let's go back to Robertson's book. He talks a lot about sensibilities. He talks a lot about, he brings in literature, lots of, Voltaire and Goethe in particular. He is a German scholar, so he has a very good understanding of German literature. And he brings Goethe, and I think Goethe is the most important literary proponent of the Enlightenment and also critic. He's a proponent of the Enlightenment in a sense that he opens up totally towards the idea of creating knowledge and explanations in a democratic way. However, in Faust, he clearly also questions the risk and openly questions the idea that maybe the scientific revolution is a pact with the devil. So this is, of course, a massive, massive critique of the scientific revolution and the idea that humans can govern themselves without God and without absolute knowledge, absolute authority, just through the process of finding better explanations and better solutions for existing problems. Faust is, I feel there's two important books, both German, written when it comes to understanding our times and understanding where we're going. One is Faust, and the other, it's not a book, it's a concept. It's the incompleteness theorem by Kurt Gödel. What Gödel says is that we can't define a system from within. In other words, pure rational logic cannot define reality. And Deutsch picks up on that and actually is very happy about it, says that thanks God, because if that was the case, we would have a theory of everything and life would be boring. And Deutsch's beginning of infinity is the exact opposite. He sees the human ability to create explanations as the most important driving force for the universe going forward. He thinks that at some point we will not study astrophysics, will not be a study of physical systems in the universe, but it will be a study of what humans can do to the universe. And that in itself is of course a very bold statement, but certainly within the realm of possibility. So now let's talk a little bit about the substrate independent idea of knowledge creation, which that's not in Robertson's book, but I'm using now Robertson's book to leap forward until today. And by the way, for new listeners, why are we talking about books like this? We're talking about books like this because the business of a hedge, the purpose of this podcast series is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. And reading is not just a pastime, but it's the business of a hedge fund manager. And particularly a book like this. Every now and then we read these kinds of massive tomes, historic tomes, philosophical tome. This is a history/philosophy tome. It encompasses lots of philosophy and lots of history and history of science. And this is really what it's all about. We are living here in Silicon Valley in midst of a massive scientific revolution, which is a new computational paradigm away from Newton, which is another big deal of the Enlightenment. It's Newton and his Principia Mathematica, which declares, in a nutshell, that life can be rational and that we can explain everything with mathematics. In particular, Leibniz, who's also a big proponent of the Enlightenment, creates calculus. So we have calculus, then we have partial differential equations, and that is the world by which the 19th century is characterized and by which massive technological innovations are enabled. And Faust questions that even before it happens. Today we are at another massive computational revolution. It's the revolution of generative AI and accelerated compute, as propagated by NVIDIA and also by Tesla. And the idea here is that we express reality not in terms of differential equations, but in terms of a distributed form of in terms of algorithms that use distributed forms of nodes or weights to encompass and learn by being fed data, and then encompass the reality in this complex relationship between the nodes, trillions of them, and then are able to act and solve problems in real life through acting in nature and becoming what we call intelligent by solving problems. So this is a new way of representing reality. It's proliferating through academia in many fields, engineering, in nano engineering, for example, in typical mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, in computer science, everywhere. It's happening across the academic world, and if it's happening across the academic world, it's only a matter of time until it's going to proliferate throughout business and then eventually also be part of the wealth generation process. This is our job at Orange Capital Partners, to capture this. So this is why this book is so crucial. It really is. This is not a historic book. We're still living in this history. The Enlightenment is still happening. It just has a different flavor. And I think David Deutsch is a very good proponent of this modern way of expressing the Enlightenment, which is we have, knowledge is substrate independent. It's about explanations, and it's Popperian in a sense that we find solutions for problems and better solutions and so on and so forth. But the key is that we are living in this process. It's happening right now. We have this massive paradigm shift in compute, which is going to create enormous amounts of wealth, the same way that the Newtonian worldview and the subsequent development of computational methods culminating in partial differential equations, Fourier transforms, they have enabled a massive feat of engineering. The Golden Gate Bridge, airplanes, cars, railway, telegraph, and then we have the introduction of quantum physics, which still lives in this Newtonian world as far as engineering applications are concerned, and the computer revolution. And now we're going to this new paradigm of compute. Now let me talk a little bit about the dangers of the Enlightenment, and then talk about the risks to the Enlightenment. Those are two different things. The dangers of the Enlightenment, as encompassed by Faust and in Goethe's Faust, are that we are derailing ourselves because we don't have a compass. This is, I think, incredibly well summarized by Oppenheimer and the development of the nuclear bomb. Of course, this is by far the most important thing that happened during those times past the Enlightenment, that we developed this bomb and now have the ability to destroy ourselves. Unfortunately, Goethe's Faust seems to be true. It is a pact with the devil, and we have this massive risk now to destroy ourselves. Now, we also have knowledge to prevent ourselves from destroying ourselves. So this is a little bit the car thief argument, that every time car thieves come up with new threats, we also can come up with new defenses. So as we create knowledge and science, it's not necessarily a foregone conclusion that we're going to destroy ourselves, because the better science we have, the better knowledge we have, the better knowledge we also have in protecting ourselves. So I don't want to be pessimistic, but it is definitely a crucial risk of the Enlightenment, or the risk. The other risks of the Enlightenment, of course, are inequality that comes with the marketplace of ideas and free markets. These are things that are certainly much bigger than the scope of this particular episode. But it's a risk. Overall, we're all better off, but the inequality is much higher. I think lots of people have talked about this. Lots of ink has been spilled on this, so I don't need to mention this more. Let me talk about the risks to the Enlightenment, or to this world that we live in of continuous exploration and finding better explanations for problems. The main risk is the risk to the democracy of ideas is, in a nutshell, central banking and centralized economic planning, which is something we're all slowly slipping into. Unfortunately, this is the truth. 1913, the creation of the Federal Reserve. A little bit before that, other European central banks, but the Federal Reserve, the most important central bank, is forming into a massive cabal of central planners who are going to destroy our economy. There's no other way to say this. And it's because they are able to monetize debt for the central government, that the central government needs to be paying for warfare and welfare, which is the only way that democracy, as we know it today, can sustain itself. And this is a self-destructive process. It's a cancer that, unfortunately, it's there. There's solutions to how to get rid of it, but again, beyond the scope of this episode. I'm just pointing out the dangers. So to summarize, Ritchie Robertson's book, The Enlightenment, massive tome, highly recommended, gives us a glimpse into the thought process and the revolutionary ideas that come throughout about 150 years worth of philosophical, literary, political thinking in Europe. Driven by the idea that humans can create knowledge and find explanations for problems independent of authority. The Enlightenment creates the base for a massive technological and welfare and wealth-creating period that we still live in. So we still live in the Enlightenment. This is one of the key takeaways of this book. We still live in the Enlightenment. The risks to the Enlightenment are that we have, on the one hand, a self-destructive tendency within science, which is nuclear bomb, etc. But the other much bigger risk is central banking. We're hijacking the wealth creation process, which is it's not the sole purpose of the Enlightenment, but it's the most important corollary which allows everybody to keep doing this. It pays the bills, if you will. And that we're hijacking with central banking. In order to finance welfare and warfare, the Federal Reserve of the United States is monetizing massive amounts of debt, increasing amounts of debt, and we're seeing the repercussions of that. COVID was just a warning sign of how bad things can get when central planning and government rogue bureaucrats take wars or pandemics or whatever they use to proliferate their own industrial complexes. This goes back to Eisenhower. We've written about this. We've had episodes about this. The military-industrial complex. All of these things are all culminating in one big question mark and one big risk, which is that we have a risk to this process of the Enlightenment, which is that the central bank of the United States, which is the most powerful economy in the world, can monetize that at infinitum, and therefore create a central planning structure in a so-called free economy, which is, of course, the risk that's exactly the risk that we're looking at. So I think this book has enormous implications for. It's a beautiful example of how a book can have real impact. This is not just some sort of pastime reading. It changes thoughts, it changes discussions, it changes conversations, it generates new ideas, which eventually end up in real manifestations of real things, of entrepreneurial activities, political activities, so on and so forth. And most importantly, I think, when we read these types of things, we also understand much better where we stand. And I think, just to end this episode again, the most important thing is we are still living in the Enlightenment, and we are actually right now at the crossroads of a new computer revolution, very similar to when Newton came up with this Principia Mathematica. And this is the beautiful arch between Robertson's book and today's times. What Newton did to the Enlightenment is what, Jeff Hinton and NVIDIA and all these compute people are doing right now, in expressing the world in different terms, still mathematical, but different, more distributed, not as deterministic. And that will allow us to capture massive, massive processes that we were not able to capture before. And this, of course, is the source for a new wave of massive wealth creation. Thank you.